Good evening. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're so excited to have one of our all-time favorites here with us tonight. And of course, we're talking about Ed Hall. Ed is one of our favorites, no doubt. But one of our all-time favorites who we have not gotten to host is Tananarive Due. Tananarive is the master of Black horror, even teaching a class where Jordan Peele guest lectured. So now her new collection, The Wishing Pool, is out, and it is a major treat, full of major scares. She is an award-winning author who teaches Black horror and Afrofuturism at UCLA. Her stories have been featured on LeVar Burton Reads and Realm. She's an executive producer on Shudder's documentary Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror. Due and her husband, collaborator Stephen Barnes, wrote for Jordan Peele's The Twilight Zone and for Shudder's anthology film Horror Noir. They also co-wrote the Black graphic novel The Keeper, illustrated by Marco Finnegan. Due and Barnes co-host a podcast, Life Writing, Write for Your Life. We also, what's that? Yeah, check it out. And you also have a amazing novel coming out in the fall, The Reformatory, which is available for pre-order now. It's already scaring the pants off of some of our booksellers. So it's a summer and fall of you, which we're very excited about. And we are genuinely very excited to have Edward Austin Hall here with us tonight. Ed co-edited Mothership: Tales from Afrofuturism and Beyond, which was acknowledged in a front page NPR.org story headline. Sci-fi has changed a lot in the past decade. These seven reads will show you how. Hall's novel Dread Isle was published in 2020, and Charis had the honor of helping launch that. You can watch that video on our YouTube channel. His novelette Green Treacheries appears in the 2022 anthology Terminus 2, and currently he is editing some transcribed and fiery civil rights related sermons by the Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian that are in search of a publisher. So if any of y'all out there are a publisher and want to help him out, let us know. So all of y'all who are watching at home, we got a great crowd watching virtually, already saying hi and weighing in from all over the country and really around the world. So thank y'all for being with us. There will be an opportunity to ask questions both for the virtual folks and our in-person folks. If you're here in person, I'm going to bring a microphone to you just so everyone can hear you. And if you are in the virtual room, please just type your question at any time and I'll vocalize it for you. So without further ado, please welcome these two esteemed folks in celebration of the Wishing Pool.
Let me know if you can hear me. Oh, it is on. Great. Everybody says I'm so excited to be here, but I really am. I was in Atlanta for I think 3 years at Spelman College while my mother was ill, and I still have a father here who's 88 years old. In fact, the titular story, The Wishing Pool, was based on the time I was going to see my father for the first time after the pandemic, and I did not know what state I would find him in. So I got that out of my system. But anyway, I just am so excited to be here. I love your beautiful eyes, even if I can't see your faces. And I guess I'll just. Did you want to do any kind of pre-chat or?
No.
Okay.
I think your plan.
So we worked out our little run of show. So
Yeah.
I'm going to do a little bit of a reading, and I like to have a timer so I know how long I've been reading. I don't want y'all drifting on me. And then we're going to do a Q&A. Oh, I don't know. I could get carried away. And then we'll do our conversation. I can't wait to hear what you want to ask me about. So this story, like a lot of the stories in this collection, comes from true life fears. Some are just human fears, and some of them are very specific fears to being African American and just Black. Why did I say African American? I don't even use that term unless I'm trying to differentiate myself from someone who's not from the United States. Black, okay? So I don't know why I said that. But anyway, Last Stop on Route 9 was the title of a short story I wrote when I was in college. And during that time, because of my exposure to the canon, and I'm not blaming any individual professor, I had great professors and teachers, but I went in, Black girl writing Black people, and I came out writing white men and white women because that was what stories were taught, that's what they look like. It's like a story is about a white character undergoing a quiet epiphany of some kind, right? And I was mimicking this sort of literary realism. I wasn't writing horror. I wasn't present in my own fiction at all. And I published a short story called Last Stop on Rotten Island in my college magazine. And it was a story about a, a random white dude who shows up at a gas station and you realize he's sick. That was the whole story. Get it? Last stop. Anyway, so I decided when I had an opportunity to write a story for an anthology, I was going to reclaim it and make it blackety black. Okay, this is one of the few literal racism as the monster stories in this whole collection. This is not a racism as the monster collection, but this is a racism as the monster story. And it very much reflects headlines that we're seeing today. So the relevance of the story will become apparent as I read it. It's based on a true life incident. My husband and I got lost on the way to a service after my mother passed away. And we were on a very rural road in northern Florida. And that's where my characters find themselves, like a 22-year-old woman who's driving her 12-year-old nephew. Where do I want to start? Okay, Charlotte. Charlotte hated the South. Her mother had fled Florida at her first chance, never coming back to Gracetown after she'd gone to UCLA as a freshman, just like Kai's dad, her Uncle Harry, who had joined the Army the day he graduated from high school. Uncle Harry loathed the town. He had spent 6 months in Gracetown's notorious reformatory when he was Kai's age, and he had blamed his parents for his imprisonment. It wasn't surprising that his son didn't feel much warmth for the recently buried Sadie Myrtle Jones Williams. Charlotte's parents had swapped Christmases between Oakland and Gracetown, but Uncle Harry's seat at the table always sat empty. His 4 sisters had taken bets on whether he'd show up for the funeral, and he had, sobbing worse than the rest. "I thought I'd have more time," he cried out in the church, although Grandmama had been 6 days shy of 80. Still, he had refused to set foot in Gracetown for a luncheon at the home of Grandmama's childhood friend. Kai was more a novelty than family to Charlotte. One reason she had been glad to give him a ride. She'd only seen the kid 3 or 4 times, and the last time he'd only been 9. 12 was a different story. He was almost as tall as she was, and shit, we're in the middle of nowhere, Kai said. "Hey," Charlotte said, "watch that mouth. You're not my mom. You don't tell me what to do." She stared at him so long that she nearly veered off into one of the ditches that yawned open on either side of the road. He had been so quiet until now that his sudden rebellion surprised her. Her voice was ice. "Don't start with me, baby boy. This is not the time." His tone softened. "I'm just saying, nobody wants to be driving around in the middle of nowhere, dang." He had a point, but although she was only 22, she felt obligated to sound parental. "Watch your mouth around me or you can walk," she said. And she threw in, "Here." Grandmama had always said that. "Here." Charlotte heard Grandmama's voice in her ear, sharp as a whip. Her throat pinched tight with a smothered sob. This awful day had no end in sight. Kai looked away toward the unbroken forest and its tangle of trees and said, "Oh, let me start this." It said, "My dad got locked up here. He told me that place was just a bunch of rednecks who hurt kids for fun. And he said Gracetown is haunted as shit." His voice trembled. For the first time, Charlotte realized he was cursing because he was genuinely afraid. What kinds of stories had Uncle Harry filled his son's head with? Grandmama had always said Uncle Harry should see a therapist, although she'd said it more like an insult than a recommendation. Her aunt said he'd never been the same since the reformatory, and maybe Grandmama had been in denial because she hadn't fought harder to get him out. To hear Uncle Harry tell it, his parents' attitude has been maybe it'll be a good wake-up call for him. Charlotte's mom had superstitions about ghosts too, but nothing like Uncle Harry's. "That was a long time ago," Charlotte said. "That place is closed now." "Whatever," Kai mumbled. But again, Kai was right. They were alone. Charlotte hadn't seen another car in 10 minutes, maybe longer. A thick fog bank sat across the road like a wall, and Charlotte felt a strong urge to stop the car and turn around. She checked the navigator. Satellite unavailable. The map showed the dot of their car surrounded by a sea of nothing. She and Kai had given up on getting a cell phone signal as soon as they passed the county line. It never failed. Whenever one thing went wrong, everything else joined in a chorus. She'd had her first car accident 2 years ago when she swerved to avoid hitting a dog on her way home from getting her wisdom teeth pulled. Today felt as cursed as that one. Worse, she just buried a grandmother she'd barely bothered to get to know. So both of her grandmothers were gone. She'd had a much closer relationship with her father's more cosmopolitan mother in Oakland, who ran a bookstore and hadn't been nearly as hard to understand beneath a thick country accent and old school rules. Fuck, she said under her breath and drove through the fog. It was so thick she braced for the car to shudder, holding her breath while all the windows went gray. I can't see, Kai said. But as soon as he said it, they passed through to the hot sun again, everything in bright focus. Only then she allowed herself to ponder it. Fog in the middle of the day during the summer? The oddness skittered across her mind, though she had shut down the part of her that wanted to panic. Like Kai had said, whatever. Evidence of civilization emerged ahead, a small billboard nearly covered by the trees with large red letters. Last stop on Route 9, 1/2 mile, gas, food. All the paint was cracking in rivulets across the weathered wood. Yes, Kai said. At the same time, she'd been thinking, thank goodness. Yeah, I left out that F word that time if you're reading along. She kept deities' names from her mind to avoid blasphemy, so close to where Grandmama had lived as if she might still hear her, or maybe, just maybe, cussing alongside God's name really was a sin. Listen, Charlotte began slowly, wondering if she'd been too harsh on Kai by threatening to make him walk. It sounds like your dad said some stuff to you that's pretty confusing and raw. Maybe he should have waited until you're older. Dad says you're never too young to know the truth. Kai recited it like a mantra. That sounded like Uncle Harry, all right. Every conversation was a speech. Yet he'd never told her about his time at the Gracetown Reformatory, not that she'd asked. What did he say happened to him when he was locked up, Kai? Kai parted his lips as if to answer, then changed his mind. He stared at the road ahead, eyes searching for the promised gas and food. He looked hungry enough to eat a wrinkled gas station hot dog or two. She'd been anticipating the feast after the funeral. Well, whatever it is, she went on, it's not happening now. It won't happen to you. What if we get pulled over and I get locked up for no reason like him? His pitch grew higher with his agitation. And then, wait, who's going to pull us over? A raccoon, she said. Nobody's out here, right? I surveyed the empty road and both sides of the thick woods and nodded, smiling a bit at her joke. Poor kid. Charlotte needed to talk with Uncle Harry and let him know to ease back on his Gracetown horror stories. Uncle Harry was the oldest of the siblings, and Kai was a son he'd had from his third marriage late in life. He and his son were from two different worlds. When would Uncle Harry have been locked up? The late 1960s? Black drivers in the South could just disappear in those days. Times weren't perfect, but they weren't still like that, at least. The gas station appeared, and Charlotte's stomach knotted. Shit. This building was an artifact, shuttered with planks across its windows. She could barely read the faded sign above the door, handy gas. It was an old-fashioned station with only two bright red pumps long out of service, their hoses emptied on the ground like oversized snakes in a blanket of pine needles. What the hell? Kai said. Exactly what she was thinking. As Charlotte slowed, hoping the gas station would morph into an AM/PM like in California, she noticed a light in the woods to the left. A driveway from the road led to it's a driveway led to a second structure behind the gas station, a wood-paneled house, hardly bigger than a cabin. But a light was on behind sheer white curtains, and a vintage round-hooded pickup truck was parked in the driveway, white paint also fading. Charlotte turned into the driveway at the last second, her tires skidding on mud. What are you doing? Kai said. There's a house. I'm going to knock on the door and ask for directions. That's crazy, Kai said. Haven't you seen Deliverance? Again, Charlotte looked at him with surprise. She'd seen the film in college, and once was enough. The banjo theme played in her head, cryptic. Your father let you watch. He says Gracetown is like Deliverance. I've never seen it, don't want to either. All right, stop freaking yourself out. Just stay in the car. Charlotte rarely missed a hashtag, so she knew that sometimes when Black people knocked on strangers' doors, they'd be met by gunfire. She remembered one Black woman's name in particular, Renisha McBride, and there were others, but she also wasn't going to let fear rule her life. It was broad daylight. She was lost. She was dressed for church. She would be fine. Charlotte didn't want to block the cabin's driveway, so she veered slightly to the right of it, a few yards from the house's door, parking beneath an oak tree that looked a century old. Something crunched beneath her tires, the sound of bad news. Damn it. Had she damaged the car? She turned off the engine and the insect songs grew louder. As Charlotte opened her car door, Kai grabbed her wrist. Wait, don't you feel it? So what, sweetie? He stared at her, earnest, trying to choose his words. His grip was a vise. It feels mad, like everything is pissed off. When she squinted, trying to make sense of what he'd said, Kai sighed and let her go. I can't explain. My dad says you can't always explain. Lock up after I get out. I'll be right back. When Charlotte closed her door behind her, Kai hit the electric lock right away. The humidity felt, you know he did too. The humidity felt soupy, and her armpits prickled with sweat as soon as she stepped outside. In a way, maybe the air did feel pissed off. She wanted to laugh at Kai, but she couldn't. And it was smart to leave Kai in the car. She remembered he was a Black male, too tall to be considered cute by many strangers. Instead, he looked like the national boogeyman since the birth of a nation and before. Kai was wearing a dress shirt and tie, but still. Charlotte glanced at the gas station behind them. Someone had made a junkyard of the station's sidewall, not as visible from the street. Rusted old cars, discarded gas cans, an old road sign advertising Fatima cigarettes, which she'd never heard of. Maybe this was what Kai had meant too. These items were pissed off because they were old and forgotten, like she had so often forgotten grandmama. Music was playing faintly from the house. Elvis? It was impossible to mistake the voice, though the music was gospel, not rock and roll. She recognized the song Peace in the Valley from the handful of times she'd attended church with Grandmama at Christmas. Charlotte did not go to the little house's sagging front porch as she'd planned. She stared, thinking it over. The plants on the porch, even in the hanging basket, were dead. Only a screen door was closed across the doorway, and despite the light she thought she'd seen from the road, the house was dark now. It was hard to imagine that light had ever shined from this house, much less a moment before. A hidden hinge squealed lazily back and forth. At the edge of the wooden awning, she saw the chain from a ruined porch swing rocking in the mild breeze. Somewhere behind the house, a dog was barking. It might not be big, but it wasn't small. Maybe it was on a chain, maybe it wasn't. Then Charlotte noticed the Confederate flag on the bumper sticker on the oversized truck parked near the porch. The words printed beside it had faded, but the crossed blue stripes and white stars still showed. Charlotte's heart thumped her breastbone. She'd known a girl at UCLA who defended the flag as heritage and insisted it wasn't racist, despite the way racists loved it. And now Kai's words came back. Everything is pissed off. How hadn't she noticed it right away? None of it felt right. Instead of stepping toward the house, Charlotte stepped away. She looked back at Kai, and he was watching her wide-eyed, his nose pressed to the window on the driver's side. She gestured toward the house dismissively. Never mind. And he nodded, agreeing wholeheartedly, motioning for her to come back. Charlotte walked back toward the car, but then she remembered the crunching sound when she'd parked. It would drive her crazy, wondering if she damaged a tire. So she leaned over to take a peek. Her left front tire had knocked over a mound of large, sharp-edged stones alongside a silver cross, tarnished black. Shit. She kicked the closest tire to make sure it wasn't punctured, then kneeled to see if the stones had left any marks on the bumper the rental guy in Tallahassee would notice. The car was fine, but broken glass was scattered across the soil from a cracked picture frame near the cross. She picked up the frame and saw a decades-old photo, the image splotched by rain and time. Vaguely, she could make out a white man's long gray beard. Desecration! A woman's voice screeched from somewhere, from everywhere. Charlotte dropped the photo frame, gasping. She was so startled. She had to hold the car's warm hood for balance, her yet yanking around too hard to see who had spoken. A woman was standing behind the house's screen door, features hidden by the mesh. All Charlotte could see was a powder blue house dress, maybe a floral pattern. The woman's face was in shadow. Had she damaged a memorial site or even a grave? The word charged through Charlotte's thoughts, so violent that it felt imposed. Desecration! The insect's buzzing seemed to flurry between her ears rather than beyond them. Kai was thumping on his window. Let's go, she heard him call, muffled through the thick buzzing. Unsteady with fright, Charlotte stumbled back toward her car door. She tried to raise her voice so the woman could hear her apology. I'm so sorry. I won't disturb you. She raised her hand slightly in case the woman was armed. She expected a gunshot. Although the woman's features were fuzzy, Charlotte thought she saw her mouth and jaw open into an impossibly long O, stretched beyond the boundaries of where her face should be. The woman let out a shriek too loud to be human. The sound echoed through the woods, rattling the metal and glass and the gas station's debris. Birds flocked from the treetops, shrieking and calling in response. The unseen dog barked in a frenzy. Charlotte's limbs locked, her mind emptied of thought. Then came an eerie, sudden silence, all sound stripped, even the dogs. Charlotte's hand fumbled with the door handle 2 or 3 times before she remembered the car was locked. She slapped at the window. Let me in, she tried to say, but her mouth was parched, mute. The click from the car door came at last, breaking the unnatural quiet, and Charlotte jumped back into her seat, banging her knee hard against the steering wheel. Kai was sitting on the passenger side floor, his face wet with tears. He pulled his hand away from the electric lock and rocked himself like a toddler, arms wrapped around his knees. It's okay, she said absurdly. She was lying to both of them. And I think I'm going to just drop it right there. Oh boy. Yeah, so we pulled into, before we began, we were lost, Steve and I, my husband, like I said, on a 2-lane road, and we saw some structures, and we thought, oh, thank goodness, civilization, and it was a driveway, but it was a compound, like several little houses, and at first I thought that was a good thing, until I noticed on a giant flagpole, a giant Confederate flag, and we went, ah! And we went and left. That's what sort of the germ of that story was.
Into that house.
Have you?
My one day selling the now defunct AT&T Uverse on one of the coldest days in the history of Atlanta. Me and another black salesman went to someplace out northwest-ish outside the perimeter. And we were walking up and down the street, and one of the last places we went, house way back from the street, entire living room window blotted out by a Confederate flag.
Wow.
And so the first thing that happened, like we were like, well, I don't want to go onto the property and knock on this door. And then the door opened and they literally sent the dog after us.
Oh my goodness.
So then somebody came out to talk with us, but that dog circled. I had to like turn in place to keep my eyes on the dog, because the dog was an ankle biter. He was going to go for the back of my leg the whole time. Finally, we got away. I was like, well,
you escaped.
So much for this job.
And the dog, too, is an interesting piece, you know.
Right.
I mean, I have a grandpuppy now, so I am now in the cult of dog, but I have not been most of my life because I had early encounters with dogs and stories my mother told about farmers sending dogs on civil rights workers trying to register voters. And, you know, people don't understand sometimes that dogs have been weaponized against Black folks traditionally. So I'm glad that I now have a grandpuppy to help me rehabilitate myself.
So, as Tananarive said before we started, her baby, Freedom in the Family, is the book you wrote with your mother.
Yes, I did.
About those years.
Absolutely.
And so the question that I had about this is it possible that you owe your entire existence to print journalism?
In what way?
So there's a Tallahassee Democrat newspaper story about your parents
Mm-hmm.
and how they met.
Yes.
And apparently your dad saw a picture of Patricia Stevens
I see where you're
before
going.
he went to FAMU.
Yes.
Picture of her demonstrating in Jet magazine.
Yes.
And then he went to FAMU.
Yeah, he
And
was
then they
trying
wound
to.
up married.
He didn't like the way things were going in Indiana. There was no movement in Indiana. He could not be a movement by himself, or felt he could not be by himself. So when he read about the Stevens sisters, my mom and my aunt were arrested in 1960 at Florida A&M University and spent 49 days in jail, he said, FAMU Law School is the place for me. And back then, Indiana would pay Black people to leave and be educated elsewhere. Yes. Absolutely. I'm sure a lot of people wish they were still doing that.
Well, so you have a past in print journalism.
Yes, I was a Miami Herald reporter for 10 years.
What was that like?
Well, you know, it's ironic now. I did study creative writing in English in college. Always wanted to just be a creative writer. Always just wanted to be a novelist. But I had been an intern in the Miami Herald since I was 15. Some of you may remember in 1980, I'm dating myself now, but the cat's out of the bag now. There was a civil disturbance in Miami over the murder of Arthur McDuffie, this Black motorcyclist that like 12 police officers beat to death and then tried to cover it up. And when they were acquitted, that was my first Black Lives Don't Matter moment. You know, it mind-boggling to me that everybody knew that the man was alive, that he got beaten up, and they lied, and then he was dead. But the jury didn't see fit to punish anyone for that. So yeah, I hate to use the word groom, but I was groomed to be a journalist from that time I was 15. And also, I'm also dating myself here. When I was in college, that was considered a stable profession, as opposed to being a novelist or a short story writer, which was not considered to be a stable profession. So that was how I became a journalist, how I landed at the Miami Herald. But literally every day, I was just dreaming of not being a journalist. I am not a journalist in my spirit. Let's just put it that way. It was my day job. I'm grateful, but it was my day job.
It seems like the paper for that. Did you cross paths with Carl Hyacin?
Yep. Carl Hyacin was there at the same time. And Dave Barry was
Dave
there.
Barry.
All that crew. Leonard Pitts was there.
Leonard Pitts.
Yes.
Oh my God.
So I'm really grateful for the people I met. And also the stories, experiences I covered made me sort of wise beyond my years in some ways, so that I could even write a book like My Soul to Keep when I was in my late 20s. You know, trying to act like I'm an immortal when I don't even know myself yet. You know what I mean?
So I'm curious, you alluded to that being the one racism as monster story here.
Yes.
I would argue.
Yeah, I might be wrong.
Right. The one about the grandmother. I think that's kind of more self-hatred, although exactly what's going on in that story.
What grandmother now?
Is she the grandmother? The one who's the actress?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. That's a
Creek
creepy story.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm just going to tell y'all right here, right now, I think the expansion of that story, which I'm calling Bear Creek Lodge, will be my next novel.
Excellent.
Because there is an element of race. It's not as blatantly racism as the monster, but it's a creature story, and I don't want to spoil it because it's kind of a subtle creature story, and it raises a lot of questions. It definitely raises a lot of questions. But some readers and reviewers are understanding sort of the uneasy relationship between a Black woman who could only get work in Hollywood in the 1930s, basically by what we would call cooning today. You know, she played a character named Lazy Maisie. I mean, that tells y'all really all you need to know. But she would do these incredible pratfalls, and I can't really think of an equivalent to her. It would be as if someone who was like a physical comedian, like a Carol Burnett or somebody like that, had been Black, and there was nowhere to put her. So she put on a maid's costume and did pratfalls where like the batter falls on her head and she's like, "Oh," you know, all that kind of stuff. Oh, lazy Maisie, you know, like a movie star, but still, you know, obviously not treated well by society, not respected. And then the story incident at Bear Creek Lodge takes place in the 1970s when she has been sort of sidelined in Hollywood history. People were distancing themselves from her and the kind of work she used to do, as if it was like her fault that that was all that she could get. And her bitterness, when she's in this wintry mountain lodge by herself for 5 years, creates an interesting relationship. And that's all I'm going to say.
Enough said. So where I was going with that unfinished question was, do you have rules around race when you are writing in specific genres or subgenres?
I don't know. I don't think so. Ever since the days when I was erasing my experiences, and I discovered that I could write horror, and I discovered that I could write Black characters, I don't think I really do have rules. I'm very lucky in the sense that, especially since I stopped writing prose full time, part of the reason there was such a long break between 7 years between books was because I've been teaching. I teach at UCLA. I've been writing a lot of short stories, and I've been trying to learn screenwriting, which is a whole thing unto itself, not just from the craft part, which is hard enough by itself, but the navigation of Hollywood is like a whole thing. And I really threw myself into that because so many people have been trying to adapt my books and nothing was ever coming of those efforts. I naively thought, well, if I write the scripts, right, maybe I can help it along. And it was a naive thought when I started because nobody wanted the author anywhere near a writer's room. Sorry, but things have changed now where they will literally pair you with a showrunner. Like authentic voices, own voices, that money really is what they're looking for. It has its limitations, but that's what I was doing. So I've almost forgotten your question now. But in that time, what was your question?
Just about like in my novel, I had one rule about a thing rules. I could not do, and I didn't do it. And I can't tell you what it was because it would be spoilerific.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
rules.
but
I do have some superstitions.
Let's hear them.
I do have some superstitions. So I started to notice probably around the time I wrote The Good House, that I would write about things that would happen in the future. Like Angela was from Los Angeles, and I had all these references to, like, I was doing all this research into Southern California. And yeah, I was married to a man from Southern California, so it's not that crazy. We always knew one day we wanted to go there, but it just seems to eerily parallel things that were actually going to happen. Yeah. Like, say, pandemics, you know, stuff like that. So
you did predict the pandemic.
So it's not solely, but I tell you one thing, I do have a rule.
Let's hear it.
Ever since my soul to keep, I do not kill children in my books. I mean, not main character like children. I mean, there's some exceptions, but it just left me like, if I had a child at the time I wrote My Soul to Keep, I don't think I could have done that. Mm-hmm. And and then I raised, my son is now 19, and I was still feeling superstitious about him while I was working on the reformatory, and it made it very difficult because that whole novel is about a reformatory. There's children who had been subjected to violence, and it was just very hard to write.
This is where I have to say, in the house I've been living in, I've written 2 stories with vampires in them.
Oh.
In the earlier one, it's all like teenagers and like middle school vampire assistants, who are terrorizing the older kids, and they're like the younger ones are escape mob, and they get on, one of the kids gets on the wrong side of them, and so they're trying to kill him. And at one point, like most of them come over the hill on their skateboards, and when he turns to look, the one that he was really mad at him comes out from behind a hedge and tries to crush his skull.
That's very
with
cinematic.
a skateboard. 2 days after that happened, I was attacked randomly on the street by a teenager who punched me in the head, was trying to like hit me in the temple and do a knockout punch. The later story that is the one in Terminus, there's a tree that collapses and almost kills the protagonist.
Oh, shoot.
Days later,
yeah, exactly.
a tree, and I didn't even know. I was like, what is that on top of that house? A tree had fallen on the house facing my house and had damaged the house, the neighboring house too.
See,
so I'm very careful about what I put in horror stories now.
I try to focus probably more so now on actual things that have already happened.
Yeah.
Rather than projecting to like future catastrophes. Hopefully.
So given your past, I mean, your parents are both in the Florida Civil Rights Hall of Fame.
They sure are.
So you have every reason to know what real heroism looks like, feels like. I mean, you were party to this too.
The real life superheroes that were to me, yes.
Where's the monsters? Where, right? Because I'm always fascinated by like,
where aren't they?
Well, but like heroism and monsters, you know, that's Alan Moore's thing. Is like for a lot of people, you know, arguably he says he's British. The British can't tell the difference. So
funny.
How do you know so much about monsters?
Well,
it's my favorite topic.
I would say that I inherited my love for monsters from my mother. And it was my mother, in fact, who was one of the people. It really was Gloria Naylor's Mama Day, but before Gloria Naylor's Mama Day, it was my mother who convinced me that it was okay to just be a writer as opposed to an activist. Because, you know, I was absorbing everything from them. Both of my sisters went to law school. And I was the like outlier. I was the artist. And I felt that work could be somewhat trite, you know. I didn't know. I wanted to have impact. Like, I'm going to keep hitting this. I want to have impact. So not surprisingly, perhaps to some of you, my mother was the one who loved horror in my past. She was the one always watching those creature features and all the horror movies. She gave me my first Stephen King novel when I was 16, The Shining. And it's only since she passed away in 2012, which was my first true life horror. And I think the reason grief works so well in horror, like even in that excerpt I was reading, they're leaving a funeral. Think of some of your favorite horror movies that begin with grief after someone is. There's so many I can barely. But grief and transgression are the two doorways into horror stories usually. And grief is the first horror we experienced. It was the first true horror I had ever experienced. And in the wake of that, and with Get Out and Jordan Peele, and giving more thought to why do people, and specifically Black people, like horror so much? Not all Black people, but why do we inherit it from our mothers and our grandmothers, right? I think it was because that was how my mother leached out her trauma from not just the civil rights era, although there was visible trauma. She wore dark glasses her whole adult life after the age of 20 because a police officer threw tear gas in her face, like literally threw the canister in her face because he recognized her as the leader of the march. 20-year-old bird-like girl. And even in this picture where she's leading this march, you can see that she's wearing these dark glasses, and that would have been, this march was, I don't know what year that photo was taken, but she wore dark glasses the whole time I knew her, 80% of the time, even indoors. So there was this very real sort of barrier, first of all, between our eyes, but also that was her visible scar from the civil rights movement. And I started to put together, oh, you know, she's carrying a lot of trauma in her body. She could have a temper, so that's part of also what comes into play in Incident at Bear Creek Lodge, because this woman also has a bit of a temper. Not my mother never did anything like what she did though, but she could yell. And I look back on that now as another version of that trauma manifesting. And one of the things that my husband Stephen Barnes likes to say is that anger is a mask over fear. So when you find people who are very angry, ask yourself, what are they afraid of? Right? And that applies politically. What are people afraid of? Payback? They're afraid of turnabout is fair play. They're afraid of being outbred, so down to a socio-biological level, just all these fears. So because of that, that's what brought me into monsters. As a kid, it was just a roller coaster ride, like, wee. But after you've been through some things, horror can really be therapeutic because it's not real. And if we walked around feeling afraid of the things that we're really afraid of all day, we would never leave the house. We would never get out of bed. We would never let our children go to school to do their little active shooter drills, right? So we are suppressing so much fear every day just to get through life. And a horror movie enables you to touch it like from a safe distance. And that monster feels like what you're afraid of. It validates fear. It validates the feeling, but you get to cheer for people who are fighting for their lives. And sometimes they win. And, in horror, sometimes they don't. But it's the fight that I think gives me strength personally. Characters who are stronger often than I feel that I am.
How are we doing on time?
I think we can open up for questions, but you do one more.
I'm not counting Steve. I just watched the Twilight Zone y'all wrote together.
Okay, great.
So apart from your husband,
it's called A Small Town, season 2.
It's great. Freebie, Amazon.
Oh, great.
What's the best advice you ever got about writing from another author?
Ooh, the best advice I ever got about writing, and not counting Steve is a big one because he's got a lot of advice. You knew that. Sure. Yeah. I would have to go all the way back to high school, and I don't know if there are any teachers here, but I have a feeling there are, and God bless all of y'all. But I had a high school teacher named Mrs. Estever in 11th grade who knew I wanted to be a writer, or I told her I wanted to be a writer. I heard through the grapevine that she liked to write. So I guess I must have gone and just asked her for advice. And she said, in order to be a writer, you have to wallpaper your wall with rejection slips. And that was the best advice. I mean, there's a lot of other advice I can give people, but all of that other advice is contingent on understanding that first piece of advice. It's like this is a slog. You think your story is wonderful, and it may be for you and your parents, but it needs work. It needs texturizing. It needs depth. It needs better word choices. It's confusing, and
And an editor.
Editors are great. So that was the one. I went through a period like everyone. Oh my gosh, I was so embarrassed. I was looking through an old journal. We moved, and I found like some old journals from my 20s. I sent Ishmael Reed, like one of the leading Afrofuturists, complete race man, one of my stories that I was writing before I was writing Black characters. He must have been like, sister, what? Wow. I was like, I was just like reading it and like so embarrassed. But that's just one of those rejection slips that went up on the wall. I wasn't in that, and really more importantly, I wasn't researching markets. I would just like send a story wherever. I wasn't reading the publication to see if it even fit with their vibe. And believe me, that story I sent to Ishmael Reed did not fit with his vibe. And that, you learn as you go, and knowing it's not just you have to get rejected. That is so vague. That can mean like once or twice. No, wallpaper your wall. That means there's a bunch of them. They will surround you. So I literally would start to put my rejection slips on the door, and I was getting rejected by some of the best publications in the country. Playboy, back when they used to do quality fiction. I don't know if they still do. Story magazine. I don't even know if that's still in existence, but I would put them up. And even then, there were times I started to lose heart. Honestly, I was halfway through My Soul to Keep before I started submitting The Between after it was rejected just a couple times. It was rejected by one agent and one contest. That was it. I never even submitted it to a publisher and had stuck it in a drawer. And it was midway through My Soul to Keep because I thought it was just another learning novel, right? Another learning exercise. So I had forgotten Mrs. Estever's advice.
Thank you.
Sure.
So, questions?
So we'll start with the virtual one, and then I'm going to bring it out to the audience here. So Jeff Patterson says, given that a couple of the stories in the collection deal with pandemics, is there anything in hindsight that you do differently if you wrote them today?
That is a great question. Probably because honestly, it's hard to even read back over old stories about anything without feeling like I would do something differently. I did not predict the denial. That feels in retrospect like a huge oversight, that people would actually believe science, that people would, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, that, and that could have been, I wish I had known, because that could have been just a story unto itself. Right. It seems like a rich area, but that was just not having experienced it and not really understanding the depth of human terror, which I guess is at the root of that denial. I think all denial has fear of death at its roots. Again, going back to what I said earlier, if we walked around thinking about the things that we're most afraid of every day, we would never get out of bed. So we're suppressing that with a kind of denial, right? And then it's very easy to suppress a lot of other things with that same denial. So that would probably be the one thing.
The story you read was extremely suspenseful.
Thank you.
I'm assuming it does turn into horror, or does it just remain?
Oh, it's actually very fantasy horror.
Okay.
Life turned up to 11. Like, this is something that couldn't actually happen in the real world.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank goodness, right? But unfortunately, in the real world, you can knock on the wrong door and end up getting shot. So this is the fantasy version of when that happens.
Tananarive, in your earlier novels, what I loved about them so much was the culture, how much you wrote the culture, Africans, and I just loved it. It just was so spoke to me.
Thank you.
To the extent that when I saw the movie Black Panther, that scene of them on, they show the whole planopy of
I know
the family.
You're about to say when they're showing Wakanda, like for the first time, it's unfolding.
Yeah.
That it looked just like Lalibela to me.
Yeah.
When I saw it.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, that is what I pictured.
And you came right into my mind. I was like, oh man, this is Tananarive right here. And I'm supposed to be watching Black Panther, but I'm like all in a fantasy about, And I just wondered what your thoughts were on, seeing that on the screen and, and then you just mentioned the fact that you can't get your stuff on the screen.
It's been hard. I mean,
it's so rich.
I have two. I mean, we're on strike officially, but so I'm not. Yeah, we are on strike. The Writers Guild is on strike. But before the strike, two of my works are in active development, and I don't know if it's a secret. The Reformatory is one of them. It hasn't even come out yet. In fact, the Reformatory was optioned before it was published. Obviously, because it was long before at this point, like 2 years before. But in terms of Black Panther, especially the first one, I'm going to limit my remarks to the first Black Panther. It's indescribable what it felt like. I mean, there was a little bit of a twinge because I've been working, some of and Blair Underwood, the actor, had been working for a very long time. And we got so close. But it wasn't the right time. And I think pre-Get Out, there was no way anything of mine was going to be adapted for, certainly for the big screen and even for television, because before Get Out, and this is almost exactly true, there just was not enough of a vocabulary among Black executives among Hollywood executives to understand what Afrofuturism was, what Black horror was. So when Black Panther and Get Out came out like right one after the other, I didn't so much feel a pinch as I was just really, really excited. Because on one level, it's like, well, if I can't get mine over that line, at least I get to see this. I get to see like that and experience that first moment of sitting in a movie theater when you see all those people, the beautiful fabrics, and it's like, oh, that's Lalibela. So Wakanda was fine and great for me. And at the same time, I understood that its success, just like the success of Get Out, was going to make it that much more likely that one day something I would get on the screen. I mean, finally, Octavia Butler got on the screen with Kindred. I mean, I know people had mixed feelings about it, but honestly, in a world where Octavia Butler had not been adapted yet, what hope did the rest of us have is kind of how I looked at it. So at least now that's broken through. So there will be more.
Yep. Wild Seed is in
It has
development,
been in
right?
development for a long time.
Naima would be so startling on screen. I love the relationship between the two stories.
Naima is my pandemic character.
Yeah,
For those of you who
yeah.
haven't, she's a little battle hardened. She's had a hard time.
And I love this. I love the fact that there's this subtle distinction that's like her point of view that like post-pandemic, where the landscape, let's just describe it for those of you who've read The Stand. So there are cars and there are empty cars, if you follow my meaning, because not everybody died at home. Let's
Right,
remind you.
right.
But I just thought, what a great way, like, yes, this is totally how you would think about it. Cars and empty cars.
Right.
So I thought that's science fiction is one of the hardest things in the world to write well.
Mm. Yeah, I didn't see the iPhone coming, so I am not a prognosticator.
Yeah, well, but it's not about the prognostication, I think. It's about what is naturalistic to these people in this world, right? Like SF is what you take for granted and making people to whom it is not natural comprehensible.
Yeah,
right?
that whole thing about not being able to predict COVID denial is an example of what you're trying to do as a science fiction writer. It's really about people, you know. Sometimes science fiction emphasizes technology or whatever, but I really feel like whether you're writing historical, which for me is very similar to writing near future, it's a world that was, and then there's a world that isn't quite yet. But the one thing that's in common is human beings. And what I'm trying to do when I do either one is to imagine myself in the year 1909. Imagine myself in, you know, the year, I forget when the Naima stories take place when she's older, but like the 2040s. And just put yourself in that environment with those limitations and those differences and imagine who would I be? Who might I be? Or what might people be like? Wherever we go, there we are. That's what I tell my students. Human beings, we have our same tire tricks. You know, we're very loving, you know, we're very loving and giving, but we definitely do have our issues. Wherever we go, there we are.
In your horror books, particularly your early work, like My Soul to Keep and The Good House, there's a lot of romance too. Sometimes like fraught romance, but sometimes good romance. I was wondering if you're sort of famous for, you know, having this wonderful collaborative relationship with your husband. Could you speak a little bit to that, how romance and, you know, writing realistic married or romantic relationships features in your work?
That is a great question. And as I'm thinking about this collection, not a whole lot of romance in this particular one. But, you know, that might speak to where I am. I've been married now for 25 years. I'm not allowed to date anymore. So... but I was very much preoccupied with that as a younger writer. My Soul to Keep, especially, that's where that whole thing came from, was my dating life. You know, I was dating these guys who seemed to be nothing like I thought they were. And then came to realize that it was, well, they had never claimed to be anything other than what they were. I just wasn't seeing who they were, right? Like you would not notice that your husband hasn't aged in 8 years and never gotten sick. You would not notice that. You know, it's, I think it was 15 years actually in her case. So, you know, but fear, which to me is always again circling around death, and love are two sides of a coin. So I think it's very appropriate. I just saw actually a disagreement about this on Twitter, which yes, I do sometimes use still, where there was this argument that romance didn't belong in horror. And I don't understand that concept at all. Because if we have to deal with these stakes where these characters might not survive, why in the world would that also not open opportunities for people to live in the moment and follow their hearts and those friendships? I mean, it's not even a friendship when you're in a life or death battle with someone. You are bonded through that. You know, The Good House is a good example of that with Miles. I really wrote that for Angela Bassett and Courtney Vance. I really so badly wanted to see them in those roles. And there was a time it was at Fox Searchlight, and I actually got to have lunch with her and talk about the possibility of that movie happening. But yeah, it's powerful. And I think also it's very interesting to note how difficult it is to see Black love in particular, even now in film and television. And I wouldn't be surprised if the love story aspect of My Soul to Keep was one of the things that prevented it from getting across that finish line in the first place. Because Hollywood has been very averse to that. And people who know, if you were around at the height of Denzel and the height of Halle Berry, the two top Black box office draws in the are Denzel and Halle never in a movie together. Now, what kind of sense does that make? No sense. So if it were today, I think it would happen. But that's where we've come from. And I think love is absolutely essential. And whether it doesn't have to be romantic love, but our relationships are absolutely essential to our journey here. That's what we anchor ourselves to through life. That's what gets us through the hard times.
To the idea that romance does not belong in horror, let me point out that funerals are a great, if perverse, aphrodisiac.
To my point, in a weird way, yes. I would say, to my point, live in the moment. We won't be here forever. Yes. Yeah, I think so. Oh.
There we go. Okay. So after the story you just read, the next one, The Rumpus Room, there's like a line that I really liked. The silence came in a gale, a disruption of their peace. You remember crafting it or how?
Oh, wow.
I just really liked the line. I just kept reading it over and over again. So I was just like,
well, wait, what's the line before?
It's on page 145.
Thank you. Because was it about assignments? Oh yeah, I thought it might have something to do with truth telling, right? Yeah. Because I don't see exactly what the line is, but I want to make sure I answer this correctly. Is it toward the bottom of the page?
It's towards the top.
Oh, towards the top. I'm on the right track for the judge. Okay, so that story is actually a good example of how I construct a horror story, which I'll go into very briefly. It has both grief and transgression. It's about a single mother who has lost custody of her daughter because, as she says in the first line of the story, she broke her daughter's arm. Now, she has contended that it's an accident, but her mother now has custody of her daughter. And her mother, by the way, was abusive. Irony. So so when she says the line, "I'm on the right track for the judge," she's telling her mother, "I'm coming for my daughter." And the mother is saying in that silence, "Bring it." So that silence is a disruption of the peace, because as long as they're not talking about that stuff, as long as they're not talking about the daughter and what's going to happen, they can talk. But when they bring in the truth, and when you talk about what's real, now the peace is disrupted. And that silence is just filling everything that neither of them dares to say in that moment.
In that same story,
Okay.
I actually copied out this line, which
shoot.
spoke to me, and I read it on Mother's Day. Either her mother was a monster, or she was, or neither, or both.
Ain't that? I mean, that's just, whew. Yeah, that's the position this character is in. And it really isn't that simple to characterize monstrosity. You know, every single person that we can think of in this room that we think of as a monster has people who love them, right? And there are people, some people might think we are monsters. I don't know, you know.
Give it enough time. No, really, I mean that.
Yeah.
The mores will
that's
change.
true. Oh,
yeah,
that's true.
I mean, like we oppress, you know, robots and artificial
Exactly.
intelligences. You know, what we've done to the biosphere will
Yeah.
be considered absolutely criminal if there's anyone around to try us in absentia.
As Steve likes to say, 50 years from now, maybe people will look back and say, you all kept animals penned up in cages and slaughtered them to eat, you know, because there will be alternatives to meat or different methods, you know, and we'll seem monstrous what we're doing. So yeah, maybe her mother's a monster, maybe she is, maybe neither, maybe both, and that's up to the reader to decide.
We have a couple more online questions before we wrap up. So Noel asks, Ms. Due, growing up with parents involved in the civil rights movement, how do you feel about the current state of our ongoing civil rights movement?
You know, the pressures against the movements are horrific and really have damaged. You know, my mother used to sign copies of our book, The Struggle Continues. That was how mine was The Dream Lives, because I was that generation after civil rights that thought the walls had tumbled down, right? But her generation was skeptical. And when I saw her in a reunion with other activists in the 90s, they were so glum. They were so glum in that Clinton 90s. And I just didn't understand. What do you know, you all should be proud of yourselves. Look what you've accomplished. It's like she knew. She didn't live to see Trump, but it's like she knew. So I feel very badly for young people. And movements are primarily made up of young people because that they have that energy and they have that idealism. I feel badly for them, but I'm so heartened by them in frontiers that were never even imagined in the 1960s in terms of social media and mobilization and the courage of standing up. I mean, honestly, even though I told you that story about my mother and tear gas, the police departments they were facing, I'll make the exception for the fire departments joining in with the fire hoses because we don't have that. But the police departments they were facing in these small southern towns were not the militarized outfits that casually patrol our streets today, like they're in Baghdad or wherever they think they are. And to stand up to an army armed with a sign, I mean, and the tactics that are used today are just horrific. And it's not just not that it ever was just in the South, but it's everywhere. Like wherever 2 or 3 are gathering, Black Lives Matter. Like I make the joke about the WGA strike, that it's so refreshing to be able to hold a picket sign and protest something without fear of being abused and manhandled or tear gassed by police. Because the film industry and television industry, while it has marginalized people, is a white argument. It is an argument between white people, right? So we're all there protesting, but don't let it be a Black Lives Matter. I mean, it doesn't matter what color you are, because as in the 60s, the kind of vitriol for so-called N-word lovers, as you can read about in Freedom in the Family, my mother knew white people who suffered greatly during the civil rights movement, because once you align yourself with Black lives, you are other, right? You are other. So I'm very, very heartened by the Black Lives Matter movement, organizations like the Dream Defenders, other organizations I'm probably not thinking of. And clearly there is much, much more work to do. And I'm just sorry that so much burden falls on, not solely on this generation, but so much of the burden falls on this generation to try to right this ship.
3 activists were just arrested on federal charges today in Atlanta on RICO charges for fundraising for other incarcerated folks. So
ridiculous.
The struggle does indeed continue.
It's just, I mean, yeah, it's really horrifying. That's the true horror.
Yeah.
That's
If I may, I
Mm,
have to read this.
okay.
This is from one of your mother's chapters. It concerns me when I hear people say, if only we had Martin Luther King today, as if we are helpless without him. I wish we had Dr. King today too, but Dr. King did not create the movement. There were hundreds and thousands of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Daily heroism went unrewarded and unrecorded. Some heroes were children and some were retired. They were maids, ministers, students, teachers, housewives, and they suffered.
Yeah, absolutely. We need more of that freedom spirit today, honestly. But not everybody was involved back then either. So, yeah.
So we're going to close with a question from Doris Davenport, who is also a writer. And Doris asks, what makes you happy? One or two things about writing, or what's one aspect that you really enjoy?
Well, gatherings like this, honestly, writing is a very solitary occupation sometimes. It's just you in your head. And I didn't know what people would think of this collection. I didn't know what people would think of the reformatory. And it's incredibly gratifying to create bridges with readers where you're sort of all seeing the same fictional world and drawing maybe different things away from the experience, but to share that experience is very special and it's very intimate. And yeah, some of the most dynamic people I've ever met were through book events, and it's just a privilege. So I think that part of it, I guess that would be the publishing part, what makes it. And then in terms of the writing, it's my happy place. I know there are writers who don't like writing. That seems like an oxymoron, but it's not. Like the physical practice of writing, there are times to me when it feels like typing, like writing an outline. That's like the most uninspired kind of writing for me, is writing an outline. Because what you really want is to start writing and then you look up and 2 hours have passed and you're like, oh, where did the time go? That's when you're in it. You're in the flow of the story. The people are real. The events are real. Planning a story and writing a story are two different things. So that's what I love. I love disappearing into a work.
Ed, I'm going to give you the last word, my friend.
Again, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
This has been great.
This has been very good. And thank you all for coming out. Thank you all for listening.
So we have a wonderful crowd of folks online who have just been appreciating this entire conversation. Ed, appreciating your moderation, appreciating your candor. So thank you both so much. Thanks to everybody watching virtually. I want to encourage y'all to click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen. That will let you buy the wishing pool, and we will send you signed copies while supplies last. You can also pre-order the Reformatory now. That comes out this fall. So get that so we can send it to you on the day it comes out. But for now, we're going to say goodnight to you and say thank you so much for being with us.